Good evening. Dear friends, I'm very glad to welcome you to the second lecture of this year's open lecture series organized by Faculty of Architecture of Estonian Academy of Arts and supported by Cultural Endowment of Estonia. And today's lecture is organized by collaboration with the Museum of Estonian Architecture, and it's part of the Future Architecture program, which introduces and celebrates innovation, experimentation, and the ideas of generation that will design the architecture and build Europe's cities in the years to come. But I think they are already doing that now. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Jason Hilgefort. Jason studied urban planning and design at the University of Cincinnati and architecture at the University of British Columbia, Vancouver. His work experience ranges from New York to Los Angeles and Mumbai, and from 2000 to 2004 he worked with Sustainable Urbanist and innovator Peter Calthorpe. After joining Maxwan in 2007, he was involved in the ongoing project Moscow A101, Central District Rotterdam, and Barking Riverside in London. Also, Jason led a series of Maxwan's competitions victories, like in Helsinki, Basel, Kiev, Hanover, Ostrava, Magdeburg, and Kaunas. During that time, Jason won European 11 in Vienna, and since then he formed Land+Civilization Compositions for investigating issues ranging from daily objects to infrastructure to cultural research. LCC is a Randstad, Netherlands, and Istanbul, Turkey based office that works and collaborates on issues related to built form with portfolio scope from research to design. LCC has office in Rotterdam and as well in Hong Kong. According to LCC, we are living at a time when the connections between the professions which are engaged in the shaping of built form are getting stronger, and differences amongst them are blurring. Local economic context and emerging social and environmental issues are leading the way to a new set of priorities. A new generation of urban thinkers is emerging, and process is becoming more prominent than the product. Please join me welcoming Jason Hilgefort.
Okay. First of all, thank you to all the organizations involved in getting me here. This is going to be an adventure. Let's see. And the microphone is working very well, so everyone can hear me being nervous. Take it out and put it back in. Unplug it, plug it back in. let's hope it's all right. Let's see. Don't touch. So yes, thank you for having me here. It's quite nice to be back in Tallinn, but it's been a while since I've been here. So yes, thank you very much. I have to start by noting, because that's what I did right before I was upstairs involved in a nice series of conversations with a few of the students here, which was really nice. One of them of which we talked about the notion of the toilet. And then I have to say, I was reminded when I went downstairs to go to the toilet just before approaching the stage of a friend of mine in university one time she wanted to design a project where the entire entrance to the art school was through the toilet, because in her mind, all art is shit. And so the idea that your archive is through the toilet is kind of amazing, and says something maybe about we're looking forward, not looking backward. But anyway, with that, I'll quit making jokes about the place that just invited me. I started out growing up, I kind of have a Dutch office legally, and I look like I could maybe be from more this part of the world, but I'm actually from very rural Ohio, one of the spots on that map. So I grew up kind of in the middle of nowhere in many ways. And these days, I live in what some would call the Pearl River Delta, or the Greater Bay Area, kind of halfway between Hong Kong and Shenzhen is where I spend my time. So I grew up in this town of 1,000, and now I live in a metropolitan region of about 60 million. And I'll come back to why I'm talking about the rural in a bit. And kind of along the way in my career, I've done a few fairly normative things in terms of practice. I worked on kind of large-scale master planning. This thing was in the States in Denver, park project we worked on in Belgium, and kind of office building that we did while we were in India. And maybe the most interesting project I'll ever work on, ever by far, is I was a part of designing an elephant village in India, which is a whole other discussion. But then, like a lot of young European practices, our office is European, so I can say European. We won Europan with a series of friends, and that got us started. Like most Europan projects, it wasn't built, but it got us going. And then this is kind of what was already read kindly in the introduction, but I think that last line is what was important to us. We started the office together with the idea that it seems like the way urbanism and the way we make cities or our habitat is starting to shift, and is starting to allow a lot of us involved in that to engage with different questions and different issues. So we're interested in building buildings, or doing master plans, or designing parks, but we're also really started the office with the idea of looking at some of the other questions that we're starting to allow to engage in. And I say we, I'm the same blonde guy on the right, and that's my partner, Merva Badir. So that's why I keep saying we. I'm not, at least I think I'm not schizophrenic. And so, yeah, like a lot of new offices, it wasn't like people were beating down the door to give us work. We started doing a lot of things that you do. You start writing, we started doing competitions for kind of hypothetical projects. My partner is much more the artist of the two of us. We even kind of do some performance art pieces as well. But maybe what got us going into the track that maybe has been more interesting for us heading into the future is when we stopped thinking of, as alluded to in the introduction, less about the object and more about the systems and more about the processes. And one way we did this is when my partner mostly led this, Merva, is when we did a documentary film about the urban transformation that was going on in Turkey through the government and through the built environment, and we started to talk to people. This was just before the protests that happened in Gezi. And we started to talk to the societies that were being affected by this, and trying to understand is how, let's say, architecture or urban planning was being leveraged as a way to impose their will upon society and let them know their power. Also as an economic tool, of course. And so this became one way where we started to get interested in these systems that, let's say, normally architects and maybe even urban planners or landscape architects don't per se talk about, that are a big part of the profession, and kind of led us on our way in terms of answering questions or framing future questions, let's say. And then also, we were in the Netherlands at a very interesting moment, at least for us. It was just after the financial issue that happened thanks to the US government generally, that caused the big crash. And being in the Netherlands at that time was interesting because the Dutch have a long-running reputation of having a good amount of government subsidies that are available to the creative industries or to many industries. But that rapidly shifted. The Dutch still have a lot of funding opportunities available, but it was a very interesting moment to see what I think everyone in the Netherlands saw to be something they believed in as something very key to their society, was pretty quickly thrown out and abandoned in a notion of austerity and these sort of things. But in many ways that led to an opportunity because being in a place like Rotterdam, there were actually like 4 different public lecture series on art and architecture, and then almost all of them disappeared very suddenly. So a few of us got together and we basically started our own lecture series where we wanted to talk about some of these things that I'm talking about now. Not necessarily architecture, but other systems and other realities related to architecture. So we actually did this out of the back of a friend's bar, starting our own discussion, inviting some artists and politicians to discuss things. But then stepping forward, we started to also lead kind of some of these people we invited to go on discussions and look at things that were happening in the city and observe them in terms of how things were being made and happening within the city of Rotterdam. And this led to, in some ways, one of our first built projects is a big word, but installations that we did within the city as part of the Rotterdam Biennale. That must have been 7 years ago or so, I guess. I don't really remember. There was a series of public space installations that were asked to be done. We were one of the people that were invited, and we said we didn't want to do it in public space. We wanted to bring the public space into the building. Friends of ours had squatted a long time ago this industrial building, actually on a pretty prominent shopping street in Rotterdam, and they were using it as a kind of a collective art gallery and working space. And we wanted to pull people inside. So all we suggested, because the area, that first logo was of Singer, the kind of sewing machine company that initially had the factory, we wanted to bring the notion of the fabric or the making back into the building in terms of a physical installation was the idea. So how could we think of this almost as a red carpet that reached out to one of the canals in the area and then pulled people inside. And for those interested how we made the things that you're going to see next, because my partner had a background, her grandma was a kind of tailor or a clothes maker, so she pointed out the interest of starch, like what makes a stiff collar, actually could make fabric structural. So we wanted to think of the fabric as being structure. So how we did it is a bit like how Gaudi initially thought of how to construct the church in Barcelona. We actually hung the fabric upside down, soaked it in a lot of starch, and then let it dry, and then we flipped it over vertically to kind of make these sort of cave-like installations in the space, and so we made these kind of objects, hanging them upside down. But beyond just this idea of the object, we wanted to make it about more than just what we did. We also wanted to talk about the processes. Rotterdam is not very known for fashion, and rightfully so. The Dutch aren't very fashionable. Not that I am either, for that matter. But we wanted to make this installation also much more active, and we wanted to host. So we invited some of the young fashion designers and clothes makers to actually occupy the space over the 2-week installation and to really work in there. So when the people were taking walking tours of this public space, they not only would come inside and they could hang out at the bar that we had kind of going, but they could also engage with some of the makers and designers that were operating and actually see how they work. And then also the idea was that we would slowly kind of collect these objects or made things, because each designer was there 2 or 3 days, and they would add to, let's say, the installation over time. And so at the end, you see this very messy looking space, but you started to see each of the designers kind of imposed in their own way on our kind of initial installation, these sort of objects that had been mostly produced during the time they were there. But this got us, the reason I mention this is this got us interested, like I said, in maybe the two ends of urban design and architecture, this idea of the object and the making, and the idea of the systems that are behind it. So maybe the really large scale to the very small scale is kind of what I'll be talking about a bit today. And then another example of this is we were invited to Cape Town in South Africa, and we started to look at actually how affordable housing was, let's say, funded. And we were working in a really low-income area, or a slum, if you want to say, or informal community, and we proposed a way to fund the public housing actually not by the house itself, but by a series of components. So to make it affordable for these low-income residents to actually, let's say, buy pieces of their house towards having a, quote, full house over time. and acknowledging the reality of investing in an informal housing development. And then also through another project, also in Africa, but actually in Nairobi, in Kenya, we worked with a very low-income community there that was next to the biggest dump site in all of East Africa. And we started to talk to them as we started to work with them, as seeing the dump as an opportunity. It's a material, it's a big pile of materials, quite literally, and could they start to take some of those materials and use them to generate the improvement of their community, whether it's tiles for buildings or brick pavers or things like this. And then back in the Netherlands, we were teaching, and we started to look at infrastructural grids and how they were working. And then ultimately we started to we started to look at, because we were working mostly in Eindhoven, started talking about small scale ideas of infrastructure, which I'll talk more and more about. But these ideas are what led us into what got me to, I now live mostly in Hong Kong and a bit in Shenzhen. This is kind of, let's say, what got us to China, was this sort of research. We were invited to be a part of the Shenzhen Biennale, to be sub-curators under Ehrenkrantz Urban Think Tank and Doreen Liu. And we ran the educational platform, which caused us to form what we call the A-Formal Academy. So it was started there, and we've been running that the last 3 years. And again, a whole long sentence, but the first part is highlighted in red for a reason. But we just wanted the A-Formal Academy to be a way not to challenge universities or traditional education structures, but to start looking at the new opportunities that come up for learning through online courses, through more engagement in direct ways, but to provide diverse ways of learning that are not necessarily within the standard bounds of the university education system. And okay, China, let's get into it. So that's not a rendering, that's real. That's the art school entrance exam. So, and I have to say one thing that myself especially, and somewhat my partner, don't necessarily see China as, quote, a bad thing, but as, let's say, a different way of doing things. And something that we can learn from and critique, but there's a lot of things to learn from what they do there. And a good example of this is this amazing graph right here, which we didn't make. But you can see at the bottom, it's the ratio of, let's say, normal people to architects. In Italy, for every one architect, there's 400 people. In China, for every one architect, there's 40,000 people. Now, a lot of people look at this and say, see, China's crazy. They have no effing idea what they're doing. And we saw it and said, well, I don't know what they're doing, but I know they're not practicing architecture in the way that I'm used to. And they're developing their country really rapidly. So how are they practicing as architects? What does this mean for the profession within that reality, and potentially for the profession as a whole? And then to back up again with China, I always like this graphic. I mean, it is always kind of striking, but yes, that the idea that more people live within that circle than outside of it is kind of astounding, but also inherently true. When you think about getting Indonesia, India, China, Japan all in one circle, that is more than half the world population. So they're dealing with very different issues than we have to deal with in the Americas or within Europe. And it's also, within that circle are some of the fastest growing economies in the world, so there's even that. But yes, I now live in Shenzhen. If you don't know where Shenzhen is, it's basically, if you leave Hong Kong and enter mainland China, you're in Shenzhen. That's what it is. But it does sit within what some call the Pearl River Delta now. And you can see through the numbers, the kind of reality of the city. It is 60 million people or so, has the economy the size of South Korea on the size of basically the Netherlands. So it's quite an urban place and quite special in terms of its reality, let's say. And in some ways it starts to become, this is actually an image, the foreground is actually Hong Kong. The thing in the background is actually Shenzhen. So there's these weird contrasts that exist there in terms of how these cities meet because of these imaginary lines they make that says one side is China and one side is Hong Kong. Or one thing is Macau and another thing is China. And so it's a very, because it's a region that grew up in different times in different parts with each city, it adds for a lot of diversity and a lot of contrast. And so when we started to look through the A-Formal Academy at the city, one thing we got really interested in was that Shenzhen especially is still a very productive city. Some people have basically pointed out that if you have a smartphone, at least some part of it was made in Shenzhen, if not all of it. And if you have an iPhone, it almost certainly was made in Shenzhen. So Shenzhen is still, unlike a lot of European or North American places, it's a place that still makes a lot of things. So it's something we wanted to look at and start to understand. So yeah, they don't just make phones, they make all sorts of things in Shenzhen. And we were interested in this. There's a huge electronics market as well. But for us then it became, okay, if we're interested in electronics and how it affects the city, because Shenzhen some have called the Silicon Valley of hardware, we need to not just be architects, we need to find other partners. So we immediately partnered with this man is David Lee. He leads the Shenzhen Open Innovation Lab, which you can see there. And we started to do research in collaboration with him on the city. And what we got interested in is there's many industrial neighborhoods in Shenzhen that are rapidly transforming. And what we wanted to take a role in as a research institute or as an academy was being active in these regions, in these neighborhoods, because the city itself was changing so fast. It had this desire, let's say, to be kind of a Western contemporary city. So they actually, in many ways, wanted to get rid of the industry in order to make room for people like you and I, kind of designer types or business class types, let's say. But what we found more exciting was, after coming from the West, being in a place like Shenzhen, it's actually a great place to be a designer because you can actually really get to the men and women who actually make the things you design. So you can really go to the factory, meet a series of factories and discuss with them how it's going to be made. You can be much more aware of the processes and therefore be a bit more creative, as well as if you're into sustainable realities, you can be much more aware of where they're getting things and how they're making things. So we started to then try and illustrate to the city government why these industrial neighborhoods are valuable. And how we did it was actually, because Shenzhen in China has a big interest in maker spaces. They're investing lots of money because they think this is the future of innovation for a lot of their younger generation to kind of understand how things are made. And we wanted to point out to them, you actually have maker neighborhoods. A lot of these neighborhoods have all the things I'm sure you have in your lab here. There's a laser cutter, there's 3D printers, there's all sorts of things scattered around the neighborhood. So why tear down the neighborhood and then put up a new neighborhood and put a makerspace in it when you can think of this neighborhood transforming over time as a place that's for designers and for makers and for industrial working class people as well. And so we invited some, in China, a good way to get them to listen to you is invite Westerners. So one, I was there, but then we invited some artists and designers from London to come and kind of work with the existing infrastructure, design. They had a whole different idea of how chairs could be made. And so they were interested in Shenzhen because they felt they could get at that there. And their idea was very simply that instead of designing one chair, and that's the one that they sell to 1 million people or to 1,000, they would design a chair as let's say a piece of infrastructure or a skeleton, and then provide a series of components so each person could customize their chair. And so through this first workshop we did with them where they were testing their idea, they allowed each participant to reinterpret the notion of the chair in their own way. And for us, this kind of was ongoing in terms of, okay, that was first about the chair, let's start to talk about how this relates to this industrial neighborhood. How can we use small scale makeable things to allow the neighborhood to transform? So creating some sort of space in between the public and the private that could be used at different times for different reasons. In southern China, people really believe in the siesta, which is one of the many magical things about living there. But also just generally this idea of also getting out of the school and really making things with people. Because I think too often, at least in terms of my architecture education, I was taught to be a bit elitist, that I do it within my office space, I meet with developers, I meet with government, but I maybe forget that architecture is really just about making things. And so we tried to construct things. Oftentimes in China you can really get to craftsmen, as I was mentioning, so we could really work directly with them to make objects and interventions. This was part of the Biennale, working with an Austrian and kind of American artist in terms of thinking about how you could reinterpret the sauna and the tea house and relate it to kind of, let's say, what's going on with the transforming city as a provocation. And we made a publication of all this. if you're interested. But we started to call this the PRD method, the Pearl River Delta method. The idea that the Pearl River Delta is not just a place, but it's kind of a methodology of how things are made and produced in a different way because of the way that they collaborate and compete at the same time as they make things. But then we wanted to actually step outside the city because, well, the issue of the rural, I think, is an extremely interesting issue. One, because I'm from the rural. Two, because partially because of the rural countryside being left behind. My country just elected Donald fucking Trump. But it's also because the issue of the rural is discussed in every country, and everyone describes it as like a very national thing. The Italians talk about how the countryside is left behind. The Chinese talk about it. My American fellow citizens also talk about this issue. But in reality, I think we all know this is kind of a reality global capital, which I'm not blaming anything. It's just I wanted to get out of that town and move to the city as well. So how can we start to think about the rural? And for us, it became very obvious the more we wanted to talk about the rural was, what the heck does rural mean anyway? I mean, in an old way, yeah, sure, there was a wall around the city, and then everything outside of it was rural and was countryside. But when you start to look at the cities today, it's a much more, yeah, as I put in that first title, it's much more of a constellation. It's much more dispersed and spread out. You can see this very obviously in a place like China, between Beijing and Tianjin and some of the other spaces. You see that it's a bit of this constellation-like space of all these smaller cities that extend out from the greater city, but that are very much connected to the city. You can see it in India as well, stretching from Calcutta to Delhi. But also this is not strictly a new phenomenon. I think especially in the, quote, blue banana stretching between London all the way down to Milan, a lot of these kind of somewhat rural spaces very much are actually pretty urban in terms of how things are made, how the economy works, how they're connected via infrastructure. They are not per se rural, or if they are, what does rural even mean? And so, but then we also wanted to notice, and we're not the first persons to talk about this, even OMA wrote about it a couple of months ago, was the idea of how production is starting to come to the rural. In China, there's what's called Taobao villages. Taobao is kind of their eBay mixed with Amazon or whatever online marketplace. You can buy everything on Taobao. It's kind of amazing. There's really great blogs that say found on Taobao, and you can see the craziest things ever. But Taobao villages got at the idea, very simply the narrative is some guy or girl was living in the city, wanted to go back home either to take care of their family or maybe just to have a more relaxed lifestyle, kind of didn't know what to do so much, started to look around, realized that in the countryside people know how to make things, plus I have the internet and a good infrastructure and logistical reality. I can have a few people make a chair, put it online. If I sell the first 10, I make the next 100. Once I sell those 100, I make 1,000. Up. So these, quote, Taobao villages in China are a real economic revolution, you could say. A lot of these are becoming very wealthy, very prosperous places. Now you can say they're just putting the factories in the countryside, which is a fair criticism. But in terms of an economic opportunity, we found it interesting because a lot of people just leave the countryside not because they want to, but because they want to have more income to provide more for their kids or a better lifestyle. But this at least allows an alternative working reality. So then we wanted to do research on this. We did this along with Columbia University, looked at a few case studies. We did the usual kind of, let's say, more normal demographic research, some more interviews and architecture understanding in terms of infrastructure. But what I thought was more interesting is when we tried to understand the economics. And these are us attempting to explain the economic investment of each rural area that we looked at. Because it's incredibly complex. It doesn't just come, despite China being a very top-down reality, the funding opportunities in these rural areas were much more layered, whether it was a wealthy man or a woman in the city kind of investing back in their heritage community, or the government as well, or some business trying to understand why and how this improvement was happening. And then a series of examples of trying to understand this investment process. So with this base, we said, and yeah, that's LCC, that's our company, because now I'll start to talk slightly more about design things. We thought let's kind of, quote, take action. let's not just research and document in a traditional academic way, let's see if we can start to maybe provoke or start to make a difference is really cheesy. But let's start to really, let's start to build something. So we were lucky enough through our kind of technology institute, which I'll talk a bit more about later, to be approached by a client in Ningde. Ningde is in Fujian province. You've probably never heard of it, and rightfully so, but you might have seen it float back past you on social media. If you've ever heard of the floating villages of China, they're in Ningde. So this is not our site. I wish it was our site, but there's this vast area that's in kind of a slightly protected bay, where there's massive groups of people that are really living on the bay themselves. So let's say that the area is a place of already incredibly interesting rural reality. But unfortunately, that's not our site. Our site sits in this valley. So Ningde, which is by Chinese cities, a small city, because it's only 3 million people. I promise you, they really talk about it that way. They're like, oh, you went to Ningde, it's so quaint. 3 million people. So Ningde is down here. Our site is here in the valley, along a very small little minor river. And it's a very nice Chinese valley. It exists, there's a small river off to the right here, a very flat plain where they've grown a lot of crops traditionally, and a series of villages that are pushed up against the hill very naturally, let's say for defensive purposes or a bit to be on high land. And slightly historic villages, not, let's say, incredible in their history, which is also a benefit to us. China has been very successful at turning a lot of beautiful historic villages into kind of rural shopping malls. So the client is a very different client. The space here, you can see a few images of what we're talking about spatially. But the client is an extremely special client, or at least a new kind of client, and relates to some of the issues we're intrigued in that the client is actually very much a technology client in, quote, a traditional way. His business model is all about collecting data and selling it. So that's what he's interested in. But how he collects data, and his data is all about actually crops. So he's developed high-end imaging technology that he can use from a satellite, from a drone, or from a camera inside a greenhouse. And he just wants to grow a lot of crops, measure them, and measure the soil, and he will ultimately sell the data. So extremely interesting architecture and urban planning client, because in reality, he doesn't care what it looks like at all in terms of his business model. He does care for the sake of society. He wants to make something nice. But the form is in many ways not important at all to the, quote, value of the project. So this allowed us to immediately just start playing around, like how do we put a village on that space where they wanted us to design a village? If it can look like anything, and in theory it's mostly inhabited by machines in terms of what's farming it, how do you design the village? And so the client then does have these high-tech greenhouses they want, which makes a great deal of sense because they're trying to do sustainable, efficient farming systems. But I used to live in the Netherlands, and I'm very aware of what these massive greenhouses can be like. You could argue they're actually really beautiful. In some ways they actually are. They look really nice in this photo. But when you see what they've done to what used to be the countryside, you realize that the Dutch countryside, at least in that part of the Netherlands, is very different. So it's been transformative economically, wildly successful. But in terms of the qualitative experience of the rural Dutch countryside, one could argue disastrous. So we wanted to talk to the client about this. Yeah, greenhouse is great, sounds awesome, but how do we keep a bit of a character of what you have in this space and bring it into these new technological spaces? We didn't want to be nostalgic, although maybe we are being a bit, but we did want to think of how can we find something between this desire to preserve this whatever abstract rural qualitative experience is to also being very high tech and expressing that as well. So we started to, very simply, the first step is pretty easy. Don't make the greenhouse huge, break it down into pieces, make it into a scale where people can walk around. They did want some people to be able to visit. They do see it as a bit of an experience for people to come and see how the food is made and enjoy the food on site. So break the greenhouse apart and make some smaller spaces. and maybe even think about how to make a pattern of it in a slightly different way. And you can see a bit of a first example. This project, like most Chinese projects, is racing ahead at breakneck speed, so we don't have the coolest images, to be honest. But you can get a hint here of how we started to illustrate to the client how you could think of making a community out of these greenhouses and maybe relate to some of the tradition through the building materials on the ground and how it can frame spaces to the sky. But the next question became, which we wanted to push, is the client did want a place for people to stay, whether living, or I'll get to some of the office part coming up, or people to visit. And then one thing we loved about this region is actually the materials they use there are fantastic. They build out of wood, they build out of stone, they build out of brick, they build out of bamboo. So they've got an incredibly diverse set of building materials. So how can we bring these, which ends up being literally, into the glass house? How can we express this material history in a more contemporary way? And so yeah, another example of the wood, and this very blurry picture on this very big screen. We found a reference, and I still don't remember which Northern European country it's from. I think it's Sweden, but could be Norway. Anyway, was what I believe they pronounce nature house, which is very simply put, just take a house, stick it inside the greenhouse. That's kind of all it is. But in a climate like you have here, it makes a lot of sense, especially in the winter. Gain a lot of heat through a greenhouse, allows you to heat the house in a much more natural way. In the summer, let's just say open the windows, and then you have a much more natural experience of having a very green experience in the winter while it might be snowing outside. But we wanted to bring this to China and talked about how we could use this as a way to express the materiality, let's say, inside the greenhouse for the residential and some of the working spaces within the greenhouse. But then next, the client also wanted their kind of office and showcase spaces. So they wanted kind of an office building, but to relate to their idea of this kind of high-tech greenhouse. So it became, how do we do this? This is a bit of an easier question, I have to say, in our mind. But again, we wanted to bring some kind of abstract idea of a rural quality into these buildings to reflect the locality, let's say. And of nature, an amazing reference project that we have nothing to do with but are super inspired by. And so we started to talk about how we could maybe create, let's say, a vertical village in terms of the office under what is a gigantic greenhouse, to create the sense of layering, or almost like a tree house is what we would call it, on the interior. And the kind of current design of one of the office buildings looks a bit like this. Basically a big greenhouse with kind of these stacked office typologies in it, with a showcase of green organic vegetables on the ground floor working. In the other space we had to do, again, a similar reality of the large greenhouse, but then we wanted to kind of place the office in juxtaposition to it, and almost in a joke, you'll see it looks like an upside down house, and have the kind of working space above it and kind of collide in this space that you can see there. And so creating a space on the top, the idea was again for it to feel a bit like the village. So the working space would feel kind of a bit like, if you want to use words like street or common space, again, I'm maybe being a bit boring and nostalgic in how I describe it, but relating a bit to the history of the area. So this interior space where they would work as office workers would sit above the greenhouse and would kind of create this environment. And then, yeah, we wanted to play the trick. The real reason we did the angle was kind of the fun of the mirrored floor. And then lastly, to the actually planted fields, how do we think of the nature? Again, it was a huge opportunity in that in terms of how they plan to farm, they will do it somewhat with hand labor, but a lot of it they plan to do with machines. And unlike, when we first started talking to the client, we said, how can we make a beautiful, productive field? And I thought of the Netherlands. Of course, I'm biased, but the tulip fields are a massive tourist attraction. And in reality, they're just kind of tulip factories. But we said we can push that one step further. If the machines are farming it, then it actually would allow the plants to be assembled in any way possible. So we started to get the list of plants that they thought they could use, and basically developed what you could just call a color palette. And as we move step forward on this, we started to illustrate how you can plant in clusters, which still makes it reasonable for the machines to farm, but start to create, let's say, a painting. And then we found some references. This is actually a rice field in Japan, where they're just using 3 kinds of rice to create this very cartoon or historic-like pattern. And now we've convinced the client, but the planting hasn't happened yet, to take this one very large field, and it's maybe tough to see, but it kind of looks like paint by numbers. Maybe some of you that are older know it, or maybe the young people do, I don't know. But to start to plant in these patterns, so it almost looks like a reflection of the skyline. Well, skyline's a big word, but of the city here, of the hills, and of that. So can we start to play around with how this field would be seen? This is kind of a key viewing point. And yeah, it sits in this larger valley here, which I'll talk a bit more now. But as architects, we also wanted to push further. As I said, we actually got into this through our tech partner, David Lee, and wanted to think about more than just buildings and design. So through David, myself in partnership with a client, this idea of the quote Fab Village, which learns a lot from Shenzhen, you could say. The idea is in many ways to just take these kind of innovation hubs or starter spaces for incubator spaces, that's what I'm trying to say. Let's bring them to the rural. So one, work with the community. So working with them, having a series of conversations, bringing some ideas of how we can do this, actually letting them vote on what their favorite ideas of how this process could go forward. And then of course, issues of sustainability. Of course, that's there. How can we think about the planting and how it relates to the processes going forward, but also sustainable, also economically, making sure there's opportunities for the people there. But then the two switches are, high tech and artificial intelligence in this. But I think maybe the biggest innovation actually came directly from David and not from me, was he said, incubator spaces are great, but where do you get the money? It still requires someone up front to put down a bag of money to support the series of new industries that want to try. And David pointed out that within China, it's so bloody competitive for young people to go to university, that they all try and do something really special on their application to make them stand out, whether they want to get into Harvard or Tsinghua or ETH or whatever they think is cool. They need something special. So parents are willing to spend a significant amount of money on the future of their children. And so that's a massive bag of money just sitting there in China. So the idea was, can we set up this incubator spaces where high school kids can come, be a part of working on these ideas, and through working on them, not yet, and through working on them, they spend their money to have this educational experience. That money actually becomes the incubator funding that leads to these companies. For the companies, they do get young, motivated labor to kind of help them out on these ideas. And through this, we set up some sort of rural innovation space or Fab Village. And an example of what this has not directly come from our project yet because we've just opened it this summer, but a really great example of how we hope this could be transformative. Again, I grew up in a very rural area and I saw a lot of my friends having to buy tractors. And if you don't know how much a tractor costs, it costs way more than most houses, even in big cities. It's extremely expensive to buy a tractor. So when you buy one, you take out a massive loan, you take a huge risk. It's scary as hell for farmers on what they need to buy. But most farms in the world don't even need big tractors. Most of them are like 70–80% of most farms are actually really small scale, and therefore only able to be managed by a human, not by a machine. But if you start to think about the possibility of creating small tractors, you can really transform this. These sort of things, which can be made very simply with a photovoltaic panel, a very simple GPS sort of location machine, very simple machine to drive, and this kind of picking object that could also eliminate maybe some of the need for pesticides because actually the weeds could be picked by the machine itself. This sort of machine can actually be made kind of by a kit of parts that almost most rural farmers could afford. So in this sort of incubation space with training, we think of bringing kids here and starting to think of how to put these things together, how to make machines, and how this kind of new tractor can emerge from an area like this. So that's the Fab Village. First Fab Village is in Yantou. And we wanted to think also about how this could give back to the community. So the existing village looks like this, some of the rural areas. So there's a lot of the city is already city. Village is half empty. So we could use this also as bringing people here as a way to activate part of the city, and also as a way to kind of give jobs. I mean, a lot of people can rent out rooms now to some of the offices that would come there, to some of the students that would come there, so it would provide revenue and other opportunity spin-offs through it. And then we've also started to, this is what used to be the old performance hall. They actually have 2 theaters in this tiny village of like 600 people, which is amazing. But this one theater we're already starting to kind of invest in terms of making it more of a community space. And yeah, the process of crowdfunding and all that we're underway and launched this summer. The next idea that we have also in Yanto, was a notion of what we call the rural biennale, and we're now in what we hope are final discussions with the government, was about stepping out of our clients' boundaries of their project and actually starting to relate to the larger framework of the region. And I call it rural be in all for 2 reasons. First, when I told the client we want to do a biennale, they had absolutely no idea what I was talking about because they're not from an art background. So I said, yeah, it's just like be in all, be in all. And then I realized actually that's kind of what we wanted to do, because we think the idea of, quote, this rural biennale could take advantage of the rural and bring together tech companies, business enterprises, also art, also architecture, and bring it together to engage in these kind of emergent issues in the rural. Because a lot of people are starting to talk about the rural. Even some of the other biennales, I believe this is the one that recently happened in Italy, are already starting to engage, yeah, this is Manifesto, are already starting to engage with the rural. And there are already existing rural, but almost always art exercises done. So we're learning from these examples and trying to think of how to do a biennale in a different way. How the installations can be permanent, how they can actually build up over 2 years quite literally, and then the showcase is at the end instead of the big party at the beginning, and then everything deteriorates and you throw it away. But so about a longer term engagement and about a more diverse group of people, let's say. And yeah, dispersed all over the region. We're not the first ones to think about this, but there's certainly the site that we're operating in. As I alluded to, we're certainly interested in the floating villages and other parts of the city. How can we engage in the diversity of the city so it's not just one event space, but more of a celebration or understanding or research on this rural reality. And in some ways, I think ironically, it might be going back to the original idea in a backwards way of what a biennale is. I mean, I think the original event in London, why am I forgetting this one on stage? The World's Fair that happened in London in like 1850? Jesus, I can't remember anything, sorry, mildly nervous. But it happened under a glass house, and it was actually in many ways about bringing productive items from all over the world to London so people could see different fruits, different animals, different cultures, all under a glass house. Now in some ways we're doing it the opposite. In terms of bringing people from the world maybe to this rural space under a glass house and do some of the installations to stay there in rural China. Okay, next project, quite a shift, but will relate, I hope, is a competition we won about 3 months ago now, and we did it in collaboration with Lola Landscape Architects out of Rotterdam and Taller Architects out of Bogota. So we competed to do a park in part of Shenzhen called Guangming, which is north part of Shenzhen, and will become more serious because the high-speed rail that just opened a week ago that goes from Hong Kong to Guangzhou stops here, and Guangming is a growing area of the city. And the brief of the client was actually pretty simple. The more urban area of Guangming is to the west here, and to the east is actually very, very natural. And so they just wanted what they called a sports and nature park. And I'll come back to how we interpreted that. But you can see it's part of a larger kind of network in the Pearl River Delta within Shenzhen and at the northern edge. And in a more practical design way, we wanted to solve the fact that there's very serious topography. To the east, the hills are quite high, and to the west is quite flat. So we inserted this kind of a red landscape or red kind of pathway through the site to connect the diverse movements. And in some ways it was also our solution to the question of what does sport mean? Because yeah, if you're a young 15-year-old Chinese kid, you can run and jump and do everything, but maybe if you're someone a bit older or someone a bit disabled, exercise maybe just means going for a nice walk. So the red path, in many ways, certainly is visually, well, the Chinese always like red, if I'm really honest, but which is something I don't like. But anyway, it becomes a way to resolve the reality of the topography. It's actually a slowly increasing sort of pathway all the way to the top of the hill. So it allows more people to experience the landscape without needing to hike and do things that are maybe more difficult if you're physically not 100%, let's say. So a series of spaces, framing, and then we start to deform the red path into creating a series of spatial objects along the way, whether it's more of a series of platforms or a simple sort of amphitheater space, or a very overly dramatic sort of space for getting your bike down into the woods. And then we create a series of other objects, pavilions on the water, because we actually want people to be able to walk on the water in this space. But I think then one last thing about architecture, let's say, is another thing we pushed is because the east side is quite remote, we actually wanted to make it so people could go camping. So we wanted to create these little pavilions out in kind of the forest where people could rent them in, let's say, a somewhat Airbnb style fashion. The client actually seems okay with this, which I'm still shocked at. So people could really rent the room and hang out. Some of our friends have joked we're making a really great place for young Chinese kids to have sex with each other, which isn't so easy in very urban China. But it certainly allows for maybe illicit activity, which is always fine and certainly not so comfortable and easy in China. Spaces like this. And then we did a bit of a playful trick where because people kept pointing out, yeah, these power lines are really a problem, and we said, that's okay, we'll make them into something very different. But what I think is more interesting about the park, and what I think relates to this kind of innovation that's come from Shenzhen, is we wanted to see how innovation could actually be related to a park and to play space. So we developed kind of two versions, since they basically were interested in nature and play, as they saw it. One was in the sports program, which basically we kind of, through our own research, we kind of said it jokingly, like, let's celebrate future sports. I think Peter said it first, and we all kind of laughed, future sports. And then we started really digging into the reality of sports and leisure, and you start to realize that there's all sorts of new sports emerging all the time, especially with our high-tech reality, and especially a place like Asia. There's also much older sports that we've left behind. So sports are actually kind of evolving. So what we proposed is a sports R&D center to really be on site. So to have a site where you could come to in the park and you could really test new sports. And so we could use it as a test center to see which sports should go throughout the site. So at the R&D center, we could test new play spaces and kind of allow the park to kind of continually evolve. And maybe this is, I'll talk about it more in the nature part, but this was also an irony of ours. We designed a few parks in the past, and we started to laugh at, the funny thing about parks is we still treat them like they're the city or they're like buildings. I mean, in reality, everything changes. But even when you design a park, landscape architects design them like they're going to be like that forever. There's never anyone that says, well, this is nature, it's going to change, and it should change. You always design it as something static. So that was kind of the subtext that we were interested in, is how we can design a park that's always changing and always adapting. So yeah, a series of these different play spaces that are themed about different realities, from technology to maybe running, or ball sports gets interpreted in really fun ways, but trying to kind of mix up. And you can see the play fields really get quite playful in terms of how we're suggesting them, and end up in these kind of very cool looking kind of icon. Well, I think they're cool. Weird looking sort of icons in terms of this play fields. And then the other was about green technology. So we also created an R&D center for nature, with the idea that we would really have a space where we could really have scientists really working on new plant technologies, maybe trying out other plants that are native to somewhere else and seeing how they could work in this climate. And then with the idea that in this sort of space, we could start to see what really would work and test out and create very special ecologies actually out in the park over time, so allow the park to really adapt. And so yeah, you can see the very beautiful section drawn by our lovely Chinese intern. But then also beyond that, relating to this notion of the park and how it's always changing, we always laughed about parks actually are always changing, but usually the nursery is on the other side of town, and the park is here, and you go with the trees over there and the flowers over there, and then you take a truck and you drive them over to the park, and then you plant them when they're the most beautiful or ready to go. And so we said, what if we take the loop that we had suggested around this, and we actually treat that as the nursery? What if the nursery was really on site? So you could really see the kind of plants coming along, and you could kind of see them ever changing. Oh, some spaces like this. And yes, the ubiquitous, necessary sky rendering, especially in China. The most recent thing we quote completed and starts to expand on our research even a bit more. How am I doing on time? No. All right. Is the transitional school, which looked at this thing called Belt Road Initiative. I don't know how well known. I think some people know this, some might not. But China is investing massively in infrastructure, putting lots of money in lots of foreign countries, and starting to, in a polite way, connect East and West through infrastructure. You could also say it's neo-colonialism, depending on your politics, but it's certainly something that's really starting to happen and starting to affect communities. So one of the places we looked at, and I should say before I switch the map, so yeah, China's over there, you guys are up there, and then kind of the Belt Road is connecting in any number of ways. So we looked in Vietnam, Bangkok, in Qatar, and in Istanbul, because the Biennale is there, so of course we had to do it in Istanbul. And so we wanted to look at, as these kind of machines, as this Chinese production starts to be exported, because they're not just exporting infrastructure and economic opportunity, they're also bringing business, which I don't even think is necessarily bad. I also don't know if it's necessarily good, but it is happening. And so we wanted to look at a few places where these sort of investments are happening. And I would also note, maybe I should just skip this, but it's also a tool to think about how borders start to blur. Some people really know Shenzhen because it was some ways known as the initial special economic zone. And to be honest, Shenzhen keeps doing new versions of the special economic zone. There's a new one now called loeng. They keep actually evolving the notion of these special economic zones in Shenzhen. I know they're spreading all over the world, but they do it there. But in many ways, Hong Kong was the initial special economic zone, I would argue. It was having Britain right next to Hong Kong and allowing, as someone nicely put one time, by creating difference, you create the necessity for exchange. So they're in some ways returning to this idea of, let's say, the Hong Kong model, which is looking at actually a foreign country and having a special thing. So as friends of ours who made a film said nicely, the borders have shifted. And so we wanted to explore in this Biennale how these large infrastructure gestures are affecting kind of communities of making, let's say. So we looked, when we went to Vietnam, we didn't just look at the factory market or the sellers. We wanted to understand how the factories that exist, that are starting to get shifted thanks to the infrastructure and economic investment, how they're being impacted. So this is actually what looks like a traditional community. When you walk in the houses, they seem fine. But in many ways, you can see the factories are really in the back. So to be honest, this research is kind of in its infancy. It is a part of our, let's say, academy research, and trying to understand how these infrastructure investments and production on a more high-end scale start to affect these more working class communities. Moving on to Bangkok, we looked at an area that makes bangbat, which are these very small metal bowls, which we'll see a picture of, which are very traditional actually, so very cultural, actually related to a lot of the religious ceremonies there, where they make them all in this kind of one community in a dispersed way. So this guy does one production on the bangbat, this person does another, and this does another. So we wanted to understand how these communities of making exist. And it's all aside of the magical oddity that are the religious views of the Thai people. So it's all kind of mixed in, the making into this community, and start to see them here. And we wanted to start to work with them, and I should be clear, we've done all of these workshops in partnership with local universities or local galleries. So this was with INDA, which is a very nice school in Bangkok. So they engaged with the community, with the idea that the community actually was nervous that the desire for their products was going down, so they wanted some attention. So we helped them kind of document their process, It's amazing, they even literally have it written on the wall how they make things in a very simple way. This is, let's say, their exhibition of making that they have at the entrance. And so we worked with the community to make a more noticeable entrance, let's say a gateway, as well as, you can see the kind of diagram there, as well as a mural of the process. So one, in terms of understanding the process, and then in some ways illustrating it and highlighting it to allow economic opportunity. For the last one I'll talk about, we went to Doha, which is in the Gulf states in Qatar. And let's say, as we talk about this Belt Road Initiative, this is a weird example because if you know a bit about politics, Qatar basically ticked off all the other Middle Eastern countries. So the Saudis and a lot of others said, well, we're not going to buy or sell your things. So Qatar had to get really creative on how they could exchange their products. Of course, they approached China, everybody's favorite partner to have these days, and they started to talk about that. But in our research there, what we wanted to look at was actually one big challenge they had is a lot of the adjacent countries used to take their metal waste. Now, until the Chinese kind of started taking it, which they had agreed to, they had an excessive amount of recyclable metal. So when we were there, we kind of looked at some of these very historic traditions of making things in the sand. And then through a workshop with the local art school, we started to talk about how to reinterpret these in a contemporary way by using these historic metal pours related to sand and making these kind of objects or craft making. This is now on display in the Istanbul Biennale, where we start to, again, understand these shifts in kind of culture making and global capital. This is us reinterpreting the banbat, trying to make it a bit of a thing. This is us in Vietnam, thinking about how electronics and traditional crafts, and some of the exhibition space. Okay, and then when we hired an illustrator, I wish I was able to do this. But an amazing sort of illustration of the Belt Road. Let's say this is kind of East Asia on here. This is Istanbul on the left, with some of the other communities represented in between. If you look closely, Xi Jinping, the head of China, is there orchestrating the whole thing, and kind of an illustration of how the Belt Road is connecting and maybe crushing some of the cultural realities along its way, as well as creating opportunity. Okay, as a closing bit, I'll talk about what I call the Institute for Autonomous Urbanism, which I started with that gentleman, David Lee. And what we started to talk about there, and this is maybe the last part of what I've been alluding to, is this notion of dispersed infrastructure. And this is where I think we as architects want to take a more activist role or educational role. Because in our mind, there's a potentially huge shift coming in the way we live and inhabit our cities. And when you start to think about what I call dispersed infrastructure, I mean photovoltaic cells. Some people in Africa are developing ways to actually draw water literally out of the air. You can start to think about self-driving cars. If you want to get into blockchain, that's a whole discussion I don't even pretend to understand. But in a very simple way, in even very lower middle-class communities, this is in rural Kenya. And they've had M-Pesa, which has been their online banking system. They've had that for longer than most developed countries. So the notion of how infrastructure, in terms of monetary infrastructure, is fundamentally changed. Because in many ways, we all have some form of infrastructure really in our pockets. We are connected to this web. What does that mean if we all have infrastructure in some way? How does that shift things? And so we start to talk about this as autonomous urbanism. And in terms of trying to see where this might be going, we like to look at the factories of Shenzhen, where you really see some of the people working really alongside the robots and how they become what some have called cobots. You see in the factories really, the machine often literally does the heavy lifting, while some of the people really do the smaller, finer scale things that at least now machines can't do. They do it kind of together. And if you start to look at some of these factories, they actually start to really look like cities in terms of how they operate, except you could argue the buildings are moving. So we see this as a bit of a hint, much like the modernist movement, you could argue, looking at industrial production as the potential future of the city. And you see other people talking about this. The ETH and a lot of architecture schools are starting to talk about the potential of these building things. Again, you can even see them, this is a nursery, where actually these little robots are moving all the time. There's an amazing YouTube video on this, it's one of my favorites, where you watch these little robots moving all the plants all the time as a nursery. And so you can start to say we have a very different way of building our cities. But what does this mean, or why does it matter? You might rightfully be asking. But we think it does matter, and this is why we start to talk to, this is an autonomous self-driving car company in China that's building a lot in Africa. They're building slower cars that are cheaper, that's more appealing to the African market. And people like Shell are also getting involved in this to develop off-power grids, or off-grid power. And so yes, you may be wondering, how can all this matter? I'm certainly not the first person to talk about this. But I think you can actually start to see it in your daily lives. Do you guys have Mobike here? Is that here? No. That's Chinese. They have it in the Netherlands. Of course, they love their bikes. But in China, let's say the entire way that people move through cities changed because a couple of Chinese people developed bikes that are attached to an app. So basically, you can get your bike anywhere, and I mean anywhere, because now with the power of the phone and GPS, I can actually take it from the station, but there's no docking point, and I can take it all over the city and leave it wherever, because my phone can find it. China's not the only one with this, it's just an illustration. But we're starting to head towards a future where we and robots kind of make and live in the city together. And what can that mean? If you want to pick up on a Le Corbusier phrase, he kind of somewhat famously said, the historic city was designed by the ass of a donkey, and the new city will be a space for men. Of course, he said very grandly, or he probably said it in French, I'm assuming. But it does ask the question of what these new public spaces or cities or streets will be if there's space for us and the machine together, especially if we acknowledge it. We've been sharing it with cars for a long time. And also the LSE has actually very correctly said this beautiful statement from one of their exhibitions, which I really like, that the city has always been shaped by its moving parts. Maybe before it was man and horse and car, but now it's something very different. And so what I'm getting at here of how these small scale technologies can transform a city, one example is Shenzhen, where I live half the time. So that's Shenzhen 40 years ago, roughly when I was born, and that's Shenzhen now. Now you can say it's economic things and all that, but in reality what really transformed Shenzhen is it was a really deep harbor. They were one of the first places to buy in to shipping containers. And so they made special tax breaks for companies to be there. It was right aside of a port, and then they could ship all over the world. So one simple technology of just making a standard box and a series of machines that can pick them up and put them on trucks and take them places fundamentally transformed not just Shenzhen, but it changed the way our world economy works. But let's say a more, quote, Western example that I like to use is this is a drawing of New York City around about 1880. And it looks like the new Amsterdam that it really was at that point. The highest points are generally churches, the new Roebling Bridge is in, but it looks very much like Europe. And then two things showed up. Someone invented a car and someone invented an elevator. And New York doesn't look like that anymore, and all the cities in the East where I am spending most of my time don't look like that. But two small-scale technologies completely transformed how we live in our cities and how we operate in our cities fundamentally. So for us, as we start to look forward, what we're getting at with this Institute for Autonomous Urbanism and trying to advocate for being more aware of what these can mean, an example would be in rural China, they're already starting to use drones as a way to deliver to kind of very off the grid, very out of the way rural places. Because they're tough to get there because of topography, so they don't need roads to get items and to connect to this global economy that I mentioned before. There's also an example in Africa of using this in a similar way in terms of medical supplies. But for us, what this starts to illustrate is, in theory, you don't need power grids, if you don't need roads, if you have your own water systems much more locally, then that means you don't need streets, in theory. And if you don't need streets, why do you need a government? And if you don't need that, then what is the role of government? I'm not saying government's going to go away, but fundamentally my relationship as a normal human being is a very different relationship with the government because I kind of have infrastructure in my pocket that's facilitated by a corporate entity. So what is this new sense of citizenship? How do we make our cities within this? Yeah, I like to show Back to the Future. But then also, what can our streets be? We don't have to see it as a threat. We're all going to need common spaces. Obviously, the need for streets still exists, but maybe they could be really different if we think about the potential of these technologies, especially in these rural spaces. Thank you very much. if any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
It's time for questions.
Hi. You were showing these projects in China that you are doing that are very like sustainability oriented and kind of, well, quite a lot, and taking into account all the local people and the local culture and so on. And at the same time, from the news, we're also getting all this quite chilling news about the dystopian directions that China is taking. So you are actually working there. How do you feel? Is it like a battle between the good and bad, or will your projects be part of the dystopian future, or will it kind of balance out, or how do you feel?
Well, I certainly hope my projects won't be part of a dystopian future. That's kind of exciting. I mean, I really like dystopian movies. Yeah. I'll say two things to this in a very fair question. One, being from the United States, you can pick up articles written by mostly Europeans 100 years ago saying how America is stupid, they're building like crazy, they don't know what they're doing, and it's super polluted. So this isn't the first time the West has showed up to another place and told them that they don't know what they're doing, and it's really scary. Now the Americans are just participating in that criticism. Yeah, I do think, yeah, China certainly has serious issues. I'm not saying it's all perfect. Their government has serious problems. I also think they've done some wonderful things. I do think for sure the Western media overhypes how much of a hellscape it is there. It's both, like most places. So there's certainly some problematic things. There are issues of how security is done. Their government is repressive. If you say something really aggressive against, actually if I wrote on my WeChat right now, which is their version of WhatsApp, Xi can go fuck himself, I think someone might meet me at some place, yeah? So you do have to be a bit, take 5% of the criticism off the top. But I do think that's super problematic. I don't know how to answer it in that way. But what I do think is how it's interesting and how it relates to things. For us as architects, to do community workshops is a different experience. People aren't so used to having an engagement process. And so at first they're almost really suspicious of it. And then they start to get enthusiastic. And to the credit of the Chinese government, again, some things are good, some things are bad, they start to really open up. So that process is getting much more open. In terms of technology, it is a bit dystopian that Chinese government has all the information, but for their technological advantage, you could think of what's even more creepy for the world is all of their companies have a massive advantage because they have a data set of 1.4 billion. And so they have an ability to advance technologically much faster. While in the West, we're super paranoid about Facebook or Google or whatever. They're not worried about that at all because the Chinese government has always been spying on them, so this is nothing new. So data is in some ways really open as long as you're inside the great digital wall. So is it a hellscape? No. Is it problematic? Yeah, it's certainly got its failures, that's for sure. I hope our project is going to help make it better, but I don't know. Thanks.
You had mentioned the car and the elevator influencing architecture.
Yeah.
To what degree, as an architect, are you either seeking out technology to work with or attempting to integrate known existing technology to work with? And what I'm getting at with that is maybe even are you ever trying to anticipate the future and trying to influence design with what you think is going to emerge in the next however many years?
I think that's a very fair question. Our hope is certainly, I don't know if we'd say influence design. Our hope is, let's say, to raise awareness. I certainly think a good example is with cars. Everyone's super excited about cars. This is the future of cities, and especially in the United States of America, we rammed them through our cities and kind of raped a lot of our cities and really hurt a lot of our poor communities in the excitement that the car is going to save things. So I think that's an example of, let's say, as an architect or urban planner, we want to be a bit of an advocate, or at least someone waving a flag saying, shouldn't we be looking at this? In terms of what it means. I think architects especially are always kind of overly excited about technology and a bit too optimistic. I'm probably really guilty of that. But I do hope through what we're talking about now is at least to kind of point out that people need to be aware of these things and start to think of what they mean. Because say in theory, architects and well, maybe not urban planners. Architects are interested in technology often. They tend to just get excited about it, but they don't necessarily highlight it as a political issue and as an issue that's coming forward. And I think especially now, people are saying things like smart cities and all this, so I'm not the first to talk about these potentials. But I do think their potential implications on the rural or the developing world are definitely not discussed enough. And in some ways, you could argue you see a bigger impact of digital technologies in the developing world. When you see what M-Pesa meant for Kenya, it was completely revolutionary in terms of the people's ability to get money and invest and do all sorts of things. So am I trying to see it as a future of design? Not really, kind of. But I am trying to see it as a notion of advocacy or creating conversation. And to be honest, that's one of the reasons I wanted to be in Future Architecture Platform, which helped me get here, is Chinese have money to build things, but don't necessarily have cultural institutions that will fund you to kind of have these discussions. Europe does. So there's a bit of a reason why I'd like to be here to frame this discussion in a place where we can be supported for talking about these ideas. And in China, while we can try and build the experiments and see what happens.
That was actually my question. Why
microphone is live.
Yeah. Why you still need office in Rotterdam?
Yeah. The reality is we barely have an office in Rotterdam. If I'm extremely honest, the benefit of having an office in Rotterdam is, as much as I said that cultural funding went away, it's still there. So technically we are a European office and we do apply for European funding at times. But no, it's also just, we founded it there, we keep it there. But we do, to be honest, legally we have a Hong Kong office now and we do operate mostly out of Hong Kong. But yeah, Dutch funds are also kind of handy. No.
What is wrong with Europe?
What is wrong with Europe? Here we go. Can we do this over drinks? I mean, like any place, there's quote failures. I guess what I would say from the outside, I'm not European, so I'm being a bit of a dick saying this now. I'm very pro European Union. I think I'm in a country that's pretty pro, so it's a bit safer than some other spaces. And not necessarily because I'm pro EU, but I'm pro experiment of what should be the future of government. This should be not just an EU thing. The whole world should be saying, what is the EU doing? Where are they screwing up? Where are they succeeding? How do we make the next good example? So this notion of a more shared and collective idea of government, I think, is totally beautiful. The fact that it's struggling now is fine as long as it survives, which I think it will be fine. But for me, that's something I hope that is not just seen as how does this benefit the EU or benefit my country, but actually Europe is being incredibly daring and having a completely forward-looking idea of the role of government, and I think that's beautiful. The other thing I think that Europe has wrong, in my opinion, so ridiculous. I think oftentimes I hear Europe, maybe they don't hear Europe. This is so funny to address an entire continent of incredibly diverse places. Is being in a place like China, people say, China's kicking our ass, we're screwed, Europe doesn't make anything anymore, what's our future? To me, as an urban planner and as someone who lives in China, like, Europe's got some of the greatest places to live on the planet. I mean, wonderful food, great cities, good transport network, incredible cultural scene in a world that's vastly becoming more interconnected. in many ways, why the hell would you want to live in Shenzhen when you could live in Tallinn or Paris or Rotterdam of all places? Like it's you guys, through the benefit of when you built your cities, you built them differently. And there's a lot of belief in culture and quality of life here that I think when Europe gets all paranoid that we're going to lose everything, they forget that they basically have some of the greatest places in the world to live. So that's what I think is wrong with Europe, is how great it is. Yeah. Thank you, Jason. Oh, yeah.
I'm just wondering about the speed and fastness you described in China and Asia, in city planning and also in construction. Is there already existing knowledge that you can bring back to Europe, or mistakes that should not be done here, or something that it's already made existing and we are just thinking about it?
No, I think there's plenty of things that can be learned from China and can be brought back to Europe or to rapidly growing Africa or the United States. One example I have very recently is now that I'm teaching at Hong Kong U, they've asked me to lead a studio where we go back to the Netherlands. And I think in many ways there's an assumption that, quote, my students will kind of learn from the Dutch method. But there's one area in Amsterdam where they're thinking of building very high density, and the Dutch are all freaked out about Hong Kong is coming to Amsterdam, which is like 8 buildings that are like 15 stories tall. But I do think there's an awareness of how cities can be more diverse, how urbanism can be much more comfortable. And in terms of speed, absolutely. Because I really think it's funny, here I'll be more critical of Europeans, where I'll hear Dutch or French or maybe people here, but I don't know, where they say, well, you can't build a city that fast. Totally ridiculous. China has been doing it forever. For some of the things that happen in our cities, I think European cities need to learn to be a bit more dynamic in terms of government and investment. The construction is certainly possible in terms of speed, but thinking about how we as city planners or regular officials can be more rapidly available for our cities to change and adapt is something that certainly can be learned from in China. China, it's super necessary. They have like 1 billion people that are moving from the countryside to the cities, so they had to do it. But now we can definitely learn lessons from them in terms of how approval processes work, how construction policies work, how funding systems work. There's a lot to be learned from the Chinese. Some of those things aren't perfect, but there's definitely lessons to be learned, absolutely. And they have massive amounts of money and they're willing to buy all your ports, so be ready for that if they haven't shown up here yet. That sounds like that's the end, yeah?
Thank you, Jason.